The private dining room at the Halcyon Hotel had gone still enough that Sophie Tanaka could hear the ice settling in the water pitcher she was carrying. Matteo Vitale sat at the head of the table, his cousin Nico at his right hand, and across from them, Hiroshi Okano, chairman of a shipping conglomerate whose signature would either open 3 Pacific trade routes to Vitale-controlled freight or close that door for a generation, listened as the interpreter finished translating his answer about route access. Sophie had been setting down bread rolls 3 feet away, and she'd heard exactly what Okano said and exactly what the interpreter had just told Matteo he'd said, and the two did not match. She set the bread basket down with more force than necessary. "Excuse me," she said, and the whole table turned. Mr. Okano offered limited, non-exclusive access to 3 shipping routes. Your interpreter just told you he offered exclusive control of those routes. That's not a translation error. That's the difference between a partnership and a hostile takeover. And if you sign based on what you were just told, Mr. Okano is going to walk out of this room believing you tried to seize routes he never offered you. The silence that followed was the kind that made waitstaff want to disappear into the wallpaper. Matteo Vitale looked at her, the way a man looks at something that has interrupted a decision worth 9 figures. "That's a serious accusation," he said, quiet and even, "from someone who isn't at this table." "It's not an accusation. It's what he said, versus what you were told he said. I can prove it." "Ask him to repeat the terms slowly, and I'll tell you exactly what leaves his mouth compared to what your interpreter gives you afterward." Across the Sneko, Vitale set down his wine glass with exaggerated calm. "Matteo, surely we don't need to interrogate the waitstaff over a possible mistranslation. These things happen. Kenji's been reliable for years." "Kenji's been reliable," Matteo repeated, not taking his eyes off Sophie. "Which is exactly why I'd like to know if he's lying tonight, and why. Have him repeat it, slowly." The interpreter, a nervous, narrow man named Kenji Sato, repeated the clause. Okano answered, unhurried and precise. Sato translated it back as exclusive control, exactly as he had the first time. "He said the same thing he said the first time," Sophie said. "Limited access to 3 points, not exclusive anything. He's betting nobody in this room, besides Mr. Okano's own people, actually understands what's being said well enough to catch the difference." Okano turned and spoke directly to his own counsel, a brief exchange in Japanese too quiet for Sophie to fully catch, and the counsel, who managed conversational English well enough for pleasantries, but had been relying on Sato for anything requiring real precision, nodded slowly and addressed the table in careful, deliberate English. "Mr. Okano," he offered access. He did not offer exclusivity. He would like to know why his words were changed. Matteo's expression didn't move, but something behind it went very cold. "Renzo," he said, and a broad, unhurried man near the door stepped forward. "Get him out of this room. Take his phone. He doesn't speak to anyone until I say otherwise." Sato started to protest. Renzo's grip on his shoulder ended the protest before it fully formed, and the door closed behind both of them a moment later, leaving an empty chair and a silence that took a long moment to fill. Matteo looked at Sophie for the first time as though actually seeing her. "You're not replacing him," he said. "You're staying to verify every sentence in this room until my legal team brings in someone certified. Sit down." It was, Sophie would think later, one of the stranger sentences anyone had ever said to her at work. She sat and finished the dinner's terms, verified cleanly against Okano's actual words. And by the time dessert arrived, Okano's guarded posture had eased enough that he'd begun addressing certain finer points directly to her, as though he'd already decided, quietly and on his own, exactly who at that table he trusted most. Nico smiled through all of it, warm and easy, and said afterward that he was relieved the confusion had been caught before it caused real damage. Nobody at the table mentioned that his hand, resting on the edge of his water glass, had gone very still the moment Sophie first spoke, or that he'd been unusually quick to suggest nobody bother questioning the staff. Matteo found her in the staff corridor an hour later, once the Ocano party had left for the night. "You could have cost my family a great deal tonight if you'd been wrong," he said. "I wasn't wrong. No, you weren't." "I'd still like to know how a banquet waitress catches a professional interpreter mid-sabotage and doesn't flinch correcting a man people generally don't correct." Until that Tuesday night, Sophie Tanaka had been almost invisible in rooms like this one, which was, in its way, exactly how she'd built the only skill that mattered here. She'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment above her mother's dry cleaning shop, raised on a diet of her father's terrible Midwestern cooking and her mother's insistence, in 2 languages simultaneously, that she never let anyone talk over her twice. Keiko Tanaka had come to America at 22 with nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn refusal to let her daughter grow up monolingual. And Sophie had spent her childhood switching effortlessly between the 2 halves of her life, English at school, Japanese at the dinner table, both of them equally hers. Her father had died when she was 19, and her mother's shop had barely survived the years afterward, which was part of why Sophie had never quite managed to leave Havenbrook for the kind of interpretation program that would have required tuition she didn't have. She had a soft, generous build that the Halcyon's uniform did nothing to hide, and that she'd stopped apologizing for years ago. Somewhere around the time she'd realized apologizing, for it had never once made anyone treat her better. She'd worked as a banquet waitress at the Halcyon for 2 years, saving toward a professional interpretation certification 1 double shift at a time, turning down every well-meaning suggestion from co-workers that she simply ask her mother for help because Keiko had already given up enough for one daughter, and Sophie intended to finish this particular thing entirely on her own. She had the kind of attention to detail that came from years of catching the small things nobody else in a room was listening for. Which fork a guest actually wanted, which words a nervous businessman actually needed, repeated more slowly, which sentence in a translated conversation didn't quite match the shape of what had really been said. There was an elderly regular, a widowed shipping executive named Mr. Halloway, who booked the same private room every month for a memorial dinner honoring his late business partner. And Sophie had learned, without ever being told, to seat him facing the window he liked and to have his order in before he finished sitting down, because some kinds of attention mattered more when nobody made a production of them. Waitstaff rarely got noticed in rooms like the Halcyons. The ones who noticed everyone else anyway tended to build a different kind of reputation, quieter and slower, but sturdier than anything built on being seen. She'd applied to a formal interpretation program once, at 23, and gotten in. A small, well-regarded certificate track 2 states over that would have meant leaving Havenbrook, leaving the apartment above the shop, leaving her mother alone with a business that had never quite recovered from the years right after her father died. Sophie had deferred the acceptance for what she told herself would be 1 year, to save enough of a cushion first. The deferral had quietly become permanent somewhere around year 3, not through any single decision, but through the ordinary erosion of always choosing the version of her life that asked less of the people she loved. The exam that would finally certify her independently, no program, no deferral, done entirely on her own terms, was scheduled for later that season, close enough to matter and far enough away to still feel like it might slip through her fingers if she wasn't careful. "My mother's from Osaka," Sophie told Matteo now in the corridor. "She raised me to never let anyone assume I didn't understand the room, and I notice mistranslation the way some people notice a wrong note in a song. It's not a skill I can switch off, even when it's inconvenient. It may have saved a 9-figure license tonight." "Then you're welcome," Sophie said, "and I'd still like my shift back. I have 4 more tables." Matteo watched her go, with the particular attention of a man recalibrating something he hadn't expected to need recalibrating that evening. Matteo Vitale had run his family's shipping and logistics operations since he was 28, inheriting an empire that moved through legitimate ports on legal contracts, and underneath that surface, through arrangements considerably less legal that kept a great deal of Havenbrook's economy running on schedules nobody official ever examined too closely. The 3 Pacific routes at the center of the Ocano license represented, by Matteo's own private estimate, more long-term value than anything his family had signed in a decade, the kind of deal that would either cement the Vitale name in Pacific trade for a generation or, handled badly enough, cost them every relationship they'd need to try again. Hiroshi Okano ran his own considerably more legitimate empire out of Osaka. 3 generations of family shipping built on a reputation for scrupulous fairness that had made him one of the few men willing to deal with a family like the Vitales at all, precisely because he trusted that Matteo, whatever else he was, kept his word once it was given. Okano had flown in personally for every one of these dinners rather than sending a deputy, a signal Matteo had understood from the first meeting as both an honor and a test. His cousin Nico had been at his side for all 8 months of the negotiation, charming, tireless, apparently as invested in the deal's success as Matteo himself. The kind of cousin people described as practically a brother at family gatherings, the kind who'd been passed over, twice, for operational roles Matteo had given to outsiders instead, a fact Nico had never once complained about out loud. Nico had grown up in the same house as Matteo for 3 years after his own father's business failed, and the closeness between them, built on decades of shared holidays, made him someone Matteo had never once thought to watch as carefully as he watched everyone else. Nico had a gift for rooms, for remembering a stranger's daughter's name, for smoothing over an awkward pause at exactly the right moment, and Matteo had leaned on that gift constantly over 8 months without ever once wondering what it cost Nico to keep offering it. A certified interpreter was formally retained within the week, a composed, silver-haired professional named Dr. Whitcomb, who treated the entire arrangement with polite bemusement, glancing occasionally at Sophie as though trying to place exactly where a hotel waitress fit into his understanding of protocol. Matteo requested her as a paid verification liaison for every remaining dinner regardless, a role the hotel's events manager, delighted at the sudden interest from one of the city's most influential families, approved without asking questions. There was a night, about a week in, when Okano's counsel raised a pointed question in a tone that could have easily read as an insult if translated too literally. And Sophie, catching the intent beneath the words, softened the phrasing just enough on both sides to keep the room from bristling without changing a single substantive term. Matteo caught her eye across the table afterward, something like approval in it. "I didn't change what anyone said," she told him later, once the dinner had ended and the room had cleared. "I just made sure they heard what was actually meant, not just what was technically spoken. There's usually a difference, and most people never notice it until it's already cost them something." "That's a skill Nico's never had," Matteo said, half to himself. "For all the years he's sat in rooms like this one." He didn't elaborate, and Sophie filed the comment away the way she filed away everything else that seemed to matter, without yet understanding how much it would matter later. Okano himself began arriving a few minutes early to each dinner. After that, ostensibly to review paperwork, though Sophie noticed he usually spent those minutes asking her small, careful questions about her mother's hometown, about a shop she'd once visited in Osaka as a teenager. Warming by degrees to a young woman he'd started treating less like hired help and more like someone worth actually knowing. "Your Japanese has an Osaka rhythm to it," he told her once approvingly. "Most Americans who learn it sound like they learned it from textbooks written in Tokyo. Yours sounds like it came from an actual kitchen." "It did," Sophie said. "My mother's, mostly. She'd disown me if I lost the accent." Okano laughed, a real laugh, and Matteo, watching from across the room, found himself unreasonably pleased that his negotiating partner had come to like her nearly as much as he had. He noticed, on the fourth evening, that she'd stayed late after dinner ended, sitting alone at the corner of the bar with a textbook open and a look of exhaustion she hadn't quite managed to hide before he walked past. "Studying," he said, more observation than question. "The exam's coming up faster than I'd like. I've been doing double shifts on top of study hours, which isn't ideal, but it's the only way I can afford the fee without dipping into money I need for other things." She closed the book, a little self-conscious. "It's fine. I've done harder things on less sleep." He didn't offer to cover the fee. She'd half expected him to, and had already decided she'd refuse. Instead, he asked what the exam covered, listened while she explained the difference between consecutive and simultaneous interpretation tracks, and admitted, a little sheepishly, that he hadn't known there was a difference. "Renzo's cousin runs a small interpretation firm downtown," he said eventually. "Freelances for the consulate. If you wanted someone to run mock exams with you, not paid, just practice, I could ask. No obligation either direction." It was such a small thing, and such a precisely correct one, that Sophie found herself unexpectedly moved by it. Not the offer itself, since she'd been offered clumsy help before by people who wanted credit for the rescue. It was that he'd listened long enough to know exactly what kind of help would actually serve her. "I'd like that. Thank you for asking instead of just arranging it." "You'd have refused if I'd just arranged it." "Immediately," she agreed, and he laughed. Renzo's cousin, a patient, exacting woman named Aiko, ran Sophie through 3 mock exams over the following 2 weeks, and Matteo, without ever quite admitting he was doing it on purpose, found reasons to be in the building during most of those sessions. Aiko drilled her on the hardest cases, rapid-fire consecutive interpretation of idioms that didn't translate cleanly, technical vocabulary from unfamiliar industries, speakers who trailed off mid-sentence and expected the interpreter to fill the gap with judgment instead of guesswork. Sophie missed exactly 2 terms across all 3 sessions, both obscure maritime insurance vocabulary she'd never had reason to encounter, and Aiko told her, at the end of the 3rd exam, that she'd trained interpreters with considerably more formal education who caught fewer nuances than Sophie did on instinct alone. "You don't have to supervise my studying," Sophie told Matteo after the 3rd session. "I'm not supervising. I'm working. You've read the same page of that manifest for 40 minutes. It's upside down, Matteo." He didn't have a good answer for that. The question of who had instructed Sato to sabotage a 9-figure negotiation 8 months in went unanswered for another week, though it sat over the household like weather. Nobody wanted to name out loud. Matteo handled 2 other pieces of business that week the old way: a supplier who'd shorted a shipment, a rival who'd tried to poach a long-time dockworker contact, with the quiet, efficient finality that had built his reputation long before Sophie ever set down a breadbasket at table 12. He never discussed those conversations with her, and she never asked, and both of them understood without saying so that the Sato question belonged to an entirely different part of him, the part he was choosing, deliberately, to handle differently. Renzo Cole, the family's broad, unflappable head of security, was the one who finally raised the possibility nobody wanted to say out loud. "Sato didn't do this for money alone," Renzo said, laying a thin folder on Matteo's desk one evening. "There's no traceable deposit in his accounts, which means he was paid in cash, protection, or a favor nobody expected us to find. Someone inside the family, or close enough to it to know exactly which clause would do the most damage." Sophie, increasingly folded into the deal's inner circle, mentioned something that had been sitting oddly with her for a week. "Your cousin joked at dinner, the week before Sato tried to change the language, that exclusive access would make the deal considerably more interesting." Nobody had discussed exclusivity with anyone yet. Not officially. I only remembered because it was an odd thing to joke about at the time. It was a difficult thing to sit with, and Matteo sat with it for 3 days before saying anything further to Renzo, turning over 8 months of memory for every small moment he might have missed. The investigation took real time, working late into several nights, cross-referencing property records and financial filings with the patient. Unhurried thoroughness of people who understood a mistake here would hand Nico exactly the argument he needed to walk free. Renzo traced cash withdrawn from a shell account registered 2 years earlier, around the time Nico had been passed over for his second operational promotion, and security footage showed Nico himself placing an envelope inside a storage unit rented under a name with no obvious connection to his own. 4 days later, the same footage showed Sato entering that unit and leaving with the envelope in hand. "It's a clean chain on paper," Renzo said. Close to midnight, coffee gone cold beside him, while Sophie cross-checked dates against the negotiation calendar from memory. But a good lawyer argues the unit isn't provably his, that the footage isn't conclusive at that resolution. Money and grainy footage prove opportunity. They don't prove instruction. "Then let's get Sato to prove the instruction himself," Renzo said. "He's facing real consequences right now with nobody in his corner. Offer him a lighter outcome in exchange for full cooperation, and let him make the call to whoever hired him, with counsel present and his consent on record." Sato agreed within a day, visibly relieved to have somewhere to put down the weight he'd been carrying alone. With Vitale family counsel present and Sato's own signed consent to record the call, he dialed the number he'd been given 8 months earlier and asked, carefully, whether the Meridian Pacific complication changed the timeline, a name Renzo had planted specifically for this purpose, mentioned only once in a fabricated memo left deliberately in exactly one office 2 days earlier. Nico answered on the second ring and asked, without missing a beat, whether Meridian Pacific's involvement meant they needed to move up the broker handoff. Sophie, listening from the next room with Matteo and the family's counsel, felt the floor tilt slightly under her. Not surprise exactly, since she'd half expected this for days, but the particular vertigo of hearing a suspicion become a fact in someone's actual voice. Matteo didn't move at all for a long moment, and when he finally did, it was only to reach over and turn the recording equipment off with careful, deliberate precision, as though handling it roughly might somehow undo what it had just captured. "Say something," Sophie said quietly, once the room had been silent too long. "There's nothing left to say that the recording didn't already say better," Matteo answered. "I just need a minute before I have to say it to his face instead of a speaker." Nico struck at Sophie's position before any of this had fully come together. Going to the Halcyon's general manager directly and framing his concern as professional caution. A banquet waitress verifying a 9-figure negotiation carried real legal exposure if her accuracy were ever challenged. It was, on its surface, a fair point, delivered with exactly the kind of reasonable concern that made it hard to refuse outright. It was also an attempt to have her removed before she got close enough to whatever he was protecting, and it cost Sophie something to realize how much of her position now depended on someone else's phone call rather than her own credentials. She told Matteo immediately. "He's trying to get me pulled. Professionally, it's not unreasonable. I'm still not certified." "He's not worried about your certification," Matteo said. "He's worried about what you've already noticed." He made one call, confirming Sophie would remain in a verification role, at his own family's liability, until the investigation concluded. "This buys you time to finish what you're actually qualified to finish yourself." "It doesn't finish it for you." She mentioned the whole uncomfortable feeling of it to her mother that night, more out of a need to say it out loud than any real expectation of advice. "I don't love that my job depends on someone else's phone call right now," she admitted. "You want it to be your own name that protects you," Keiko said, unsurprised, in the practical tone she used for most of Sophie's problems. "That's fair. But a name takes years to build the kind of weight that protects you on its own." Until then, you use whatever's offered, and you keep building yours underneath it. That isn't weakness. That's just how long things actually take. Matteo called Nico to the estate 2 days after the recorded call, the full evidence spread across the desk, Sophie and Renzo present. I don't know what you think you've found, Nico said, arms crossed, composure fully intact. I've been as invested in this deal as you have from the beginning. You knew about the root exclusivity clause before I briefed you on it, Matteo said. Explain that. I hear things around this family. That's not evidence of anything. The storage unit traces to an account you control, Renzo said. It held the cash. Sato withdrew 4 days after the exclusivity language was mistranslated. We have the footage. We have the registration paperwork. Anyone could have used that unit, Nico said, an edge entering his voice. I'm not the only person in this family with financial flexibility. I never once spoke to Kenji Sato outside of formal business settings. You just told us you've never spoken to him outside formal settings, Sophie said quietly. Nobody asked you whether you'd spoken to him at all. Nico's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. Fine. I've spoken to him. Every executive in this family has spoken to the deal's interpreter at some point over 8 months. That's not a confession. Matteo pressed play instead of answering. Sato's voice, then Nico's, unmistakable, asking about the broker handoff, filled the room until Matteo stopped it. Nico's mouth opened, then closed, searching for a version of the last 30 seconds that could still be argued with, and finding none. The silence that followed lasted a long time. You gave outsiders every real position in this family for 8 years, Nico said at last, all pretense gone. Once the deal collapsed, I would have brought Okano back through a broker I controlled. You'd have handed me the Pacific Division because I'd be the only man capable of saving it. That was always the whole plan. Not revenge, not sabotage for its own sake. I wanted what I'd already earned and never been given. You'd have insulted Okano's entire delegation and risked this family's name with every Pacific partner for a decade to get it, Matteo said. You'd know something about being underestimated, Nico said, if you ever paid attention to anyone standing slightly to your left. Before Sophie, Matteo would have solved a betrayal like this in a room with no witnesses, quietly, permanently. This time, he'd wanted evidence strong enough to survive daylight. He didn't have Nico killed or publicly ruined. Instead, he forced a full buyout of Nico's ownership stake at a steep discount, banned him permanently from any operational role, required full restitution for the deal's legal costs, and had him sign a binding non-compete before revoking his access to every family system entirely. Nico was relocated to a small West Coast property with no management authority over any part of it. Renzo walked Nico out. Matteo stayed behind, standing very still at the window for a long time after the car had gone, and Sophie, instead of leaving him to it, or offering something to smooth the moment over, simply sat down and stayed. The light outside had gone the particular grey of early evening before either of them said anything at all. Matteo's hands, resting on the desk, hadn't moved from the position they'd been in when the recording ended. You don't have to translate this into something easier, Matteo said finally, not looking at her. He was my brother in every way that mattered, and I still failed to see what he'd become. 8 months, sitting beside me at every dinner, and I never once wondered why the closeness never quite worked both directions. Then don't make it easier, Sophie said. Just tell the truth in the language it hurts in. He did, for longer than either of them expected, about the house they'd grown up in together. About a father Nico had lost too young, and a promotion Matteo had genuinely believed didn't matter as much as he'd apparently made it seem, and she listened without once trying to fix it or hurry him toward feeling better. And something settled between them that had nothing to do with the deal at all. The 10 days between the confrontation and the closing dinner passed quietly. Matteo threw himself into the unglamorous work of unwinding Nico's stake and rewriting the family's internal protocols with the same discipline he brought to everything. and Sophie kept working her regular shifts at the Halcyon in between verification dinners, neither of them rushing toward whatever came next. Renzo, watching the two of them dance carefully, around a conversation neither had quite had yet, took to leaving unsubtle hints. A reservation accidentally, made for two at a restaurant neither of them had asked about, a comment about how quiet the estate felt without anyone dropping by unannounced, until Matteo finally told him, without much heat, to mind his own business, which Renzo took as a request rather than an instruction, and therefore did not honor even slightly. A closing dinner was held 10 days later. Not the full ballroom Matteo had first considered, but a smaller room reserved for Ocano's own delegation, the Vitale family's inner circle, and the Halcyon's senior leadership, exactly the people who actually needed to hear anything at all. Sophie attended as a guest this time, not staff, in a dress that followed the generous curves her uniform usually hid, and Matteo, catching sight of her, lost the opening line of the toast he'd rehearsed twice in the car. Her mother had helped her pick it out, the two of them spending an entire Saturday afternoon in a shop neither of them could really afford, working through a rack of dresses. Sophie kept steering away from anything too bright, too fitted, too likely to draw the kind of attention she'd spent years learning to deflect. Keiko had finally taken the dress off the rack herself, held it up, and said, in the tone she used when a point wasn't up for debate, that a woman didn't dress smaller for a room just because the room was expensive, and that hiding a body worth being proud of wasn't the same thing as modesty, whatever anyone had ever told her otherwise. Sophie had stood in front of the mirror longer than she meant to afterward. Not out of vanity, but because it had been a long time since she'd let herself simply look, without immediately cataloguing what she'd change. Renzo found her near the coat check an hour before the toasts began. You look like you're about to clear someone's table. Old instincts die hard. You earned the dress and the seat at that table more than most people in this room earned theirs. He offered his arm. Come on, Boss is hopeless at small talk before his first glass of wine. An internal breach nearly compromised this agreement, Matteo told the room once dinner had cleared. It was identified and permanently contained. I take full responsibility for not seeing it sooner. This agreement survived because Sophie Tanaka heard one lie and refused to let an entire table ignore it. He didn't name Nico. He didn't need to. The people in that room who needed to understand the shape of what had happened already did, and the people who didn't need to know anything further about it left that dinner with exactly the amount of information the situation actually required. No more, no less, which was, Sophie thought, its own kind of precision. Ocano rose, glass in hand, and said something brief that his counsel translated, that the partnerships worth trusting were the ones built on people willing to say an uncomfortable truth out loud. The room raised their glasses towards Sophie, and she found herself, for one warm and unfamiliar moment, unable to think of anything clever to say back. Matteo found her again near the dessert table. The verification position is still open once your certification's official. Separate offer. You can turn it down and nothing between us changes. I'll consider it on my own timeline. She studied him. Was that the whole offer? No. He looked oddly uncertain for a man who'd just closed a 9-figure license. Will you have dinner with me sometime neither of us is working? No negotiation, no verification. Just dinner. Only if you stop pretending every dinner needs an interpreter. I can manage that. 2 months later, Sophie sat the exam and passed, funded entirely by her own savings. She'd taken the promised dinner with Matteo weeks earlier. No negotiation, no verification. Just a small restaurant where he'd ordered badly in his still clumsy Japanese, and she'd let him struggle through it, because he'd asked her, specifically, not to cue him from the attempt. It had become, without either of them planning it, a standing Thursday arrangement. No business discussed. Renzo under strict instructions to interrupt only for actual emergencies, a rule he'd already broken twice and apologized for exactly once. By the 6th Thursday, The restaurant's owner had started seating them at the same corner table without being asked. And by the 10th, Matteo had stopped glancing at his phone entirely for the length of the meal. A small change nobody but Renzo seemed to notice, and one he brought up constantly, to Matteo's visible and entirely performative annoyance. Matteo attended the small ceremony marking her certification, sitting quietly in the back row instead of anywhere that might have drawn attention away from her, and afterward asked, formally this time, whether she'd consider the position she'd once left open. Keiko Tanaka, invited for the occasion, studied him across the reception with the scrutiny of a mother who'd spent 30 years reading a room before it decided what it thought of her. She'd met him twice before, briefly, and had reserved judgment both times with the patience of a woman who'd learned not to trust first impressions of powerful men. "You're the one who let my daughter finish something on her own terms," she said, in Japanese, testing him. "I tried," Matteo answered in careful, halting Japanese of his own, the product of weeks of evening lessons he'd told no one about except Renzo, who'd found the whole endeavor endlessly funny and helped anyway. "I'm told it's the only kind of help that counts with her." "Good," Keiko said. "She doesn't tolerate people who don't try." She patted his arm once and moved off to find her daughter, leaving Matteo with the distinct impression he'd just passed a test he hadn't fully understood the terms of. "Lesson 1's Thursday," Renzo said, appearing at his elbow. "Don't be late. You've been humming vocabulary in the car for a month, boss. I'm observant. It's the job." "I'm never late," Matteo said. "You're the one who's been late to everything since a certain waitress corrected your interpreter at table 12. "Worth it, though," Renzo said, allowing himself the smallest, most satisfied smile of his career. "I'll admit that much." If this story kept you guessing, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had to prove they were right in a room that had already decided not to listen, in a voice or a language nobody expected them to have. And tell us in the comments, if you were Sophie, would you interrupt a mafia boss's negotiation with nothing but your own ears as proof, or stay silent and protect your job until you had something safer to stand on? Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.